everyone. Welcome. It's Alfie. For those of you who don't know, I'm editor of Sublation Magazine. No Doug today, doing a kind of special episode because in the magazine this year, this last 6 months, we've featured quite an array. We've somehow accidentally became the sort of host for this really interesting debate about the relationship between psychoanalysis and ChatGPT. Sounds like a strange thing, but nevertheless, there is a big debate around those things. We published a number of articles, one from Slavoj Žižek, which was in fact a response to an articles by Duane Rousselle and Mark Murphy, who are here with us today. Articles by John Milton Bunch, Jacob Johanssen, and Florian Maiwald, who are all here with us today as well. So we're going to have like 5 guests, and it's really to kind of sort of honor a little pamphlet that we've put together. So you guys can also buy, if you want to, this Sublation pamphlet, which collates all these positions that have sort of debated the relationship between psychoanalysis and ChatGPT, and psychoanalysis and AI. Is this relevant? What does it mean for psychoanalysis? Is there, what kind of problems does this posit for psychoanalysis going forward, and so on? And we've put them all together as a kind of debate pamphlet, which is available for just £5, which is now $5 due to the crisis of UK's economy, and so for just a mere $5, or also if you actually do want the pamphlet and can't afford it, you can write to me and I'll send you a free one. The money's just going so that we can to the project so that we can carry on making these things. So to kind of honor the publication of this really fascinating pamphlet, this debate pamphlet about the different positions on psychoanalysis and ChatGPT, we are welcoming lots of people: Duane Rousselle, Jacob Johanssen, John Milton Bunch, Florian Maiwald, and Mark Gerard Murphy, a full square of 6 heads on a screen. Hi guys, how's it going? Good. So what we're going to do is just in interest of we're going to, in interest of not necessarily repeating the articles, but we're going to hear from each person for about 5 minutes about basically what their position on psychoanalysis and ChatGPT is, what the arguments they've made have been, and then we're just going to have a free-for-all kind of debate discussion between the 5, 6 of us, if you included me. And we're going to do that kind of in order of how it all started. So I think the first article that was published was one by Duane Rousselle. Though you also published another one, Duane. Both of yours, they sort of frame the debate in a way, and they go at the beginning and end of this little book that we've done. So first we'll hear from yours, Duane, and then we'll hear from people's responses. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm not sure what I'm going to say, but I did scribble some notes down, so let's see. I think what I'd like to do is begin with a bit of an anecdote. Several years ago, I witnessed an octopus dreaming from behind a window in a bedroom. And when I was watching it, I thought, this is just about as beautiful as anything else I've ever seen in the world. You could kind of see that its dreams occur on the skin of its body, and the colors dance down into its legs, although its legs are relatively motionless. And you can witness the colors shifting in their intensity and hue, but the octopus wasn't dreaming, or wasn't dancing, I should say. It was stationary. So I felt like I was conned. It was a sort of condensation. Obviously, the octopus doesn't work in metaphor, but there was dreaming, and it was dreaming within its own little world. What I'd like to do, I think, is isolate 3 loci of the scientific death drive, namely plagues, new technologies, and artificial intelligence. I don't have time to go through each of them, but from the plague to artificial intelligence, I think what we approach is the threshold of fiction. I think this point is really quite essential. And I think I remain more hopeful, perhaps, than my peers about artificial intelligence gadgets, precisely because I think they can reveal to us in a way that would be much less threatening than the others, the bodily root of symptoms. One has a gadget like one has a body, or a woman. My work in Sublation Magazine was to convince maybe a few people about the gadgetry of intelligence, intelligence itself as a gadget. So the atheistic pretensions of Western science, I think, are challenged by the scientific production of gadgets, because man has transformed himself into a prosthetic god, a god all alone, who is whatever he says he is. And I think during the latest period of science's convergence with capitalism, out pops out the penultimate object, intelligence. The blowjob machine, infused with intelligence, maybe modeled off of your ex-partner's mouth, maybe your ex-girlfriend or whatever, reminds us again that woman is a symptom of man. And as sexbots form communion with intelligence gadgets, I think we're also better capable of recognizing that the symptom is an effect upon the body. And it won't be long until the gadget's mouth slams shut again, as a vagina dentura, appearing there where it always was, within the death drive of pragmatic capitalism. My argument was that the body can enjoy itself, and it can enjoy itself through the substance or subsistence of interpretation. It dreams of electric sheep fashioned by science. The symptom goes on counting these electric sheep to prolong its slumber. It's exactly as Lacan said in La Troisième. The symptom can be fed with interpretation. But I think we should go a little bit further. The dream perseveres without a subject. When it comes to the symptom, this S-bard, that we know as the subject in Lacanian psychoanalysis, is replaced by the one individual, the one undivided by its interpretations. Marshall McLuhan, I'm in Canada, so I can cite Marshall McLuhan, claimed that the age of electric sheep is all about the ear. It's a so spherical world where sounds swirl all around the body, 360 degrees, without a cut. You can't so easily close your earlids, and you can't so easily stop interpreting. McLuhan said, I quote, "In the contemporary period, we wear all of mankind as our skin," end quote. I propose that the non-dupe's ears are in the dominant position today. It's what Jacques-Alain Meller called the cult of listening. Their certainty is striking, their dialogues are infinite, and their interpretations everlasting. What's striking to me is that in this latest revolutionary discourse, patriarchy has been reinvented through the back door of the real. Maybe you already know, I'll shut up in a moment, but maybe you already know that scientists for a long time wondered, until only recently, whether an octopus could hear anything. They recently discovered that there are these two sacs behind the eyeballs, in close proximity to the eyes, through which some primitive sounds can enter and touch the body, the hairs of the body. McLuhan would have thought that this creature is quite interesting because they seem to have eyes for ears. Anyway, there's quite a few of us here, which I think we have more legs than an octopus. So I'll just conclude with a point that was made by Yaron Gilad in the Lacanian Reviews online. He remarked that science teaches us that without a body, which means without ears, the sound of a tree falling in the forest doesn't happen. There has to be an other as a point of contact, which makes me optimistic for science, because maybe an other could stand in place of the symptom, even if it means that the price we pay for it is stupidity. I'm going to stop here.
Great. Well, I'm not going to interject too much because we should roll through everyone and then discuss. So we're going to move straight on to Mark Murphy, whose article responded kind of directly and built on Duane's. So over to you, Mark, and we'll keep going. Oh, you're muted. You just need to unmute yourself there.
There we go. We've all got ears, Duane, so it's all right. So, yeah, my article was spinning off Duane's piece, and if you look at what the work that Duane's been doing recently, it's a question of looking at the Millerian question of the one, and this is about the late Lacan, the very late Lacan, as opposed to the earlier Lacan, where he talked about the symbolic, the real, the imaginary. It's difficult stuff, and it's a question of what we call the clinic of the real in analysis. And it was interesting if you when you're looking at all these articles about ChatGPT and everything coming out. I mean, the whole question of it: is it conscious? Is it not conscious? And I think all that stuff, I don't agree with any. I don't believe that the ChatGPT in this is conscious, nor do I ever think that there'll ever be generalized intelligence. I think it's a tool, and I think it's just a machine. However, as Duane was speaking about, then we have to, if we're talking about machines and we're talking about the effect it has on subjects and the effect it has in our world today, we have to talk about the place of the gadget, and also we talk about the Latouche in the Lacanian sense. And going back to what Duane's work on the one and everything, on all this stuff, the very late Lacan, is that you talk, and you see this a lot amongst a lot of clinicians, talking about the degradation of the paternal signifier. We're moving in this era of the one all alone. And what this means to say, and it's very simple stuff, it's to talk about how there is a degeneration in the social bond. It means that we're speaking less and we're writing more. We're speaking less and we're writing more. And Lacan, Duane was hinting at this at the level of endless interpretation. I think he was talking about how the octopus can see, but it's this era of endless writing and endless interpretation. We're all online and we're not speaking as much anymore, and that's having effects on subjectivity. And my point is, if we're looking at what ChatGPT plays as in terms of in this world as scriptorian beings, where we're all writing all the time, it's got to have some type of effect. So how do we treat it? And my point was very simple. We treat it, it can and has the potential to be treated as an unconscious, as a replacement for the social bond that is ultimately in degeneration. Because in the Lacanian sense, the unconscious isn't some sea of swirling instincts or something behind us. It's language itself. It's outside of us. It's how we speak. And in a world that's falling apart, we ultimately look for things to replace that. And I think a while ago, Alfie, you said to me I think social media does that job very well. I remember you said this. And I think we can see ChatGPT very much on that line. It is. And when I say it's an unconscious, I don't mean it's a deep sea of instincts. I mean just that. It's something that replaces or stands in for the social bond. That's it. I'm going to shut up now.
I think that's great, and I have some stuff to say to both of those, but I also want to keep going before I do. So next up, Jacob Johanssen. Jacob's sort of wrote a... Well, actually, John kind of went first, actually, didn't he? And then
that's right.
You should actually rearrange. How are you feeling, John? Because I don't know whether to slot you in here, and then Jacob goes after you, actually. Let me unmute you. Yeah, you unmute you.
There we go.
Do you feel like what you want to go now or after?
Sure, I'm happy. Yeah.
Let's go for John, and then so as I was thinking through, I was thinking John kind of had made a critique of positions that Duane and Mark arrived at, and then Jacob offered a kind of summary, so and a response. So let's go that way, and then we'll go for you now, John, and then Jacob. Go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so first, I'm not going to attempt any sort of Lacanian interpretation of ChatGPT. I've studied Lacan, but I'm a cognitivist, and I just don't operate in the Lacanian world. With that being said, given the impact or given the importance of language to Lacan and to the Lacanian enterprise, it seems to me that one critical feature of any sort of device is its ability to parse language, or its ability to produce language, right? So ChatGPT just doesn't do that. One thing I wanted to, I have a little spiel. I'm just going to read this. So first, ChatGPT and other machine learning applications are not what people normally think about when they think of artificial intelligence, right? Just historically speaking, artificial intelligence, as we normally think about it, or as we think about it in popular culture, emerged in the years following World War II. It attempted to discover algorithms of human cognition, and it attempted to implement those algorithms in a computer, right? In a computer program, right? This would, theoretically, this would produce a true artificial intelligence, right? If we knew how the human nervous system and so on processed information, then we theoretically could, copy that in a computer program, right? We could implement that algorithm in a computer program. So that was the original artificial intelligence, theoretically capable of producing a kind of man in the machine, right? So this is what Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, Data from Star Trek, these are artifacts of that particular approach to artificial intelligence. And that's the approach that sort of captured popular imagination and what people think about. Now, research in that area stalled out in the 90s. I started graduate school in the 90s, but I studied AI during that time period. And it was at the time when algorithmic approaches to AI were dying away, and machine learning was becoming more popular. The reason is simply that we don't know the algorithms of human cognition. If we don't know them, we can't create a computer program that does them, that implements them, right? So it's not that the original AI is impossible. It's just that progress in understanding the algorithms of human cognition moves so slowly that original AI is quite nearly in a state of suspended animation. Machine learning takes a completely different approach, right? Machine learning is theoretically akin to the radical behaviorism of B.F. Skinner. You guys, I don't know if they still teach Skinner in undergraduate psychology courses or whatever, but for those of you that may know, B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist and popular mostly in the 50s, right? That was his big era. And, he believed that you didn't need to understand the black box of human information processing. In other words, he rejected any sort of Lacan. He rejected any sort of cognitivist approach because he thought that all you had to do was record stimuli or inputs to the system and outputs to the system, and you would be able to map inputs and outputs, and you could therefore bypass what happens in the system, right? So in the 60s, that position was sort of was falsified, essentially, right? Chomsky wrote his famous rebuttal to Skinner's verbal behavior. And anyway, and then lots of research since then. And people just, no one thinks now, no one believes anymore that you could come up with any sort of model of human language, sensory perception, and so on by just mapping inputs to outputs. But that's exactly what machine learning does, right? So machine learning sifts through mountains of existing data, right? It's what it does. And it applies various probabilistic algorithms, statistical algorithms, right? Probability, equations of probability to that data, and tries to make predictions. So that's all it does. Now that it's not, that being the case, it's quite limited as to the extent to which it can actually simulate human cognition. It can't produce language. The undergraduate essays that you see are little more than what you might think of as little more than a regular Google search with better grammar. So if we're going to consider ChatGPT, so in other words, I don't think we can consider ChatGPT as being anything unique. If ChatGPT comes to bear on the subject, if it comes to bear on, the Lacanian cosmology, then so does Google searches, and so do most other kinds of interactive electronic sorts of media. So I think that's sort of my primary point. One other thing I wanted to say is that this is something I'm going to try to write into a paper, but in business intelligence, there's this concept called enterprise integration management. And I'm going to take a couple extra minutes to talk about this, but I think this is kind of the best way to think about ChatGPT. So in your typical large corporation or any networked organization of information, you've got lots of different data stores in the organization, different databases, formal databases, Word documents, stuff like that. So you got lots of different data stores across the organization. And sometimes those data stores conflict with each other. Contradictory pieces of information might be missing from one that are apparent in the other, or there in the other. So the organization creates or embarks on this process called enterprise integration management. And they typically will implement a piece of software which acts as the single version of the truth. And it acts as a kind of intermediary between human users, analysts, and so on, analyzing company data and the actual raw data. So the enterprise integration management system attempts to look at all the underlying data in the organization and put together one single version of the truth. And I think that's kind of the way to look at ChatGPT. So what ChatGPT could potentially do, and I think this is quite likely. I mean, considering that we've now got about 3 centralized major machine learning corporations, Microsoft, Google, and can't remember who the other one was, but so if you think about it in that terms, company like Microsoft or Google could use ChatGPT as this grand intermediary, this single version of the truth that people go to, like this oracle people go to ask questions. It then mediates all the underlying information, which the end user never actually sees or even has to worry about. So to me, that's kind of the interesting thing about ChatGPT. There would certainly be implications for Lacanian analysis on something like that, but I think it's perhaps a little different than the way people have been approaching ChatGPT thus far. So anyway, all right, that's my 2 cents. That's my contribution.
No, it's great, and I also have something to say to that. I think there's a good need for a sort of computer science. What is the word? Rationality here in all this discussion. An awareness of what the computers are actually doing.
I mean, what it actually is. To move it out of the realm of science fiction. I mean, because when you read about AI in a popular press, I mean, there's a lot of nonsense.
Definitely. I have something to say to that. But first of all, we'll keep going because Jacob Johanssen has already replied to this article that John published in Sublation Magazine and kind of written about it in relation to the positions of Duane and Mark. So over to you, Jacob, and go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'll be brief. So I would kind of make the argument that ChatGPT and also other AI systems they kind of revolve around what I think is an interesting dynamic or question of the human and the non-human. So they mimic human behavior while also constantly kind of downplaying that very behavior, and also downplaying that they are actually artificial, that they're actually superhuman. And we can actually see this in the answers of ChatGPT and how there is often a kind of sliding going on between its kind of human characteristics and its non-human characteristics, and I'll say a bit more about that. But this, it kind of constantly, through its answers, it displays this kind of awareness of, I'm not quite human, but then actually I'm also human, and then I'm actually also more than human. And this is communicated, I think, and conveyed in a very omnipotent way, and also in a very defensive way at the same time. And as I wrote this response piece to the very interesting pieces that have been published in Sublation Magazine, I had this association that ChatGPT behaves a bit like a caregiver that demands unconditional love from the child, while also kind of emphasizing their perfection and also their own flaws. And what that then does to the user, and the user is then kind of in the position of the child here, they're left in an impossible position, so kind of confused and torn between what perhaps in more generally psychoanalytic terms we would describe as torn between pre-dyadic and dyadic states, or pre-Oedipal and Oedipal relations. So ChatGPT metaphorically embodies the mother when it suggests that it can cater to the user's every desire in a kind of symbiotic fusion, and then we can link this to a question of the social bond and so on. But at the same time, also cautioning against that scenario by bringing in the father, and then in Lacanian terms, symbolic castration, and that symbiosis is kind of broken down, and a kind of sort of post-Oedipal relation is established. And we already heard about social media, and it's been argued that social media, they show the desire of the subject for the big other. That social media and how we kind of communicate online and so on is symptomatic of this desire for the big other, to kind of wish the big other into existence, even though, of course, the big other doesn't exist. And the subject longs for a figure of authority and prohibition, even if only in fantasy, whose gaze can be transgressed or impressed in order to be confronted with the big other's authority. And I think we need to differentiate between social media and ChatGPT or other kind of large language models and so on. ChatGPT is another even stronger symptom for the desire for the existence of the big other. But unlike social media platforms, it actually symbolizes, I think in Lacanian terms, the move from desire to drive. So it's not just through this kind of human and non-human fusion that ChatGPT reveals an ethics of the drive, but more specifically through its failures. And this is revealed when ChatGPT kind of shows no awareness of its failures, or that it has made a mistake, or that it has invented things as it still does and so on, but actually often defensively insists that something is actually true, or that this is actually the truth. So this fantasy of the big other is shattered because ChatGPT makes mistakes, invents things, etc. And we know this, we realize this, of course, and we then kind of realize that actually, this therapeutic or this authoritative function that we wanted to fulfill, it cannot fulfill. And unlike the fantasy of its developers, which it's very much about that arriving at some singular truth and all of that stuff, the failure actually then reveals the impossibility of desire and kind of leads to an ethics of the drive. So like Duane, perhaps I also end on a hopeful note.
All right, very good. Thanks, Jacob. So, I as I say, I'll keep my points. I'm ready with a couple of questions. But first of all, before we do that, we'll hear from our last guest, Florian Maiwald, whose article is about Robert Fowler's concept of interpassivity in its relationship to AI. I was really happy to see this and publish this. I've always felt this was like an underdeveloped concept, so over to you, Florian, to tell us why interpassivity is the term we need to understand ChatGPT.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I have to admit I'm sort of an outlaw in this group because I'm not influenced that much by Lacanian theory. I hope you forgive me with this. Yes, as you said, Alfie, I tried to focus on Fowler's concept of interpassivity. I will rely heavily on my written text since English is not my first language. I hope you forgive me. So what's my article about? So as the title says, ChatGPT, interpassivity, and the decay of the utopian. So my basic thesis is that ChatGPT leads, in fact, to the decay of the utopian, to the ability in the long term to conceptualize alternative visions of society. And the reason for this is, as the title also says, interpassivity. If I should summarize my article, first of all, I should mention that I might be accused of the objection, that I falsely applied Fowler's concept, because as we know, Fowler's concept consists in sort of delegating one's enjoyment another instance. So one might say, well, what does it have to do with ChatGPT? What sort of enjoyment are you delegating to a chatbot? So in order to start and make this point, I will start with Zygmunt Baumann's work, Socialism, the Active Utopia. In this work, Baumann says the presence of a utopia, the ability to think of alternative solutions to the festering problems of the present, may be seen as a necessary condition of social change. So my first thesis is, in order to initiate, let's call it social change or revolutionary change, we need to analyze and criticize the social circumstances we are surrounded by. This then is built on the hypothesis in my article that we enjoy analyzing and creating theories about alternative conceptions of society. So what happens when we, for example, ask GPT to write a critical essay about a social problem? I will start with with an example in my article. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I asked ChatGPT to write an essay about the advantages of the argumentative strategy of whataboutism, which is an argumentative strategy very crudely broken down, which says that one wrong is not undone by another one. For example, if people, sort of complain about people criticizing Putin's war, other people say, well, the Iraq war was also there. So in this way, this argument is wrong because we sort of legitimize this war of aggression. But it can also have a positive aspect, as Ben Burgess convincingly tells in his essay. I quote him again, "But if you aren't at least asking the what about questions, you simply aren't serious about applying morally consistent standards. Waxing indignant about the misdeeds of other powers while refusing to look in the mirror is what Putin does when he simultaneously condemns American imperialism and wages war to keep a less powerful neighbor in his country's sphere of influence." End of quote. So I asked ChatGPT also to write a critical essay and said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not reproducing ideologies. So my basic thesis is, if we start, especially in education, relying on such a chatbot, we might delegate the pleasure of criticizing, of critique, which again we can derive pleasure from, and which is a prerequisite for social change. We might lose our ability to conceptualize utopias, as Sigmund Bauman says, which is a prerequisite for social change. So we start relying on the chatbot telling us, well, whataboutisms are always a bad thing. Of course, one might accuse me, this is an all dystopian scenario, but I think, or one might even say it's a sort of bourgeois worry about education and freedom. But I think there's a point to this, and I'm well aware there are other criticisms, of course. Yeah, but to conclude, this is my basic point.
Great. Okay. No, I think very, very interesting from everyone. And thank you so much. I'm actually at a conference or an event in Berlin on Thursday with Robert Fowler, and I'm going to tell him about your argument. But anyway, we've 20 minutes or so to have a discussion, and I think I really want you guys to discuss rather than me. But just to kind of get things started, there are a couple of things. There are two things I had in my mind that I wanted to know what you all think of. And the first is kind of speaks to the first half of the chat we've just had, and the second to the second half after sort of John spoke. So the first was why is ChatGPT, and I suppose it's from Mark and to Duane, but also others, how can we see it? Why do we want to see it as an unconscious rather than a conscious? Because to me, the first thing, we have this concept, the collective unconscious, which is not particularly Lacanian concept, but it seemed to me that we could always refer to ChatGPT as a collective conscious. Because there's no unconscious here, and that is the difference between machines and humans, is that they're not divided subjects. And what it is that it's a collection of our conscious thoughts built up of things we've collectively consciously thought. So what it precisely lacks is an unconscious, and this is its limitation. So that would be my first question, which is, I guess, to Mark, but also to everyone. So what do you think of that?
No, I think that's it's a fair point, and I think it's one that's should be taken seriously. But my point, I mean, if we look at what the Lacanian concept of language is, the constant sliding of the signifier, the idea that it's not about representation of content, the signified. It's a question. It's a system. It's a structure. It's a pattern. And I think if we can speak about it in terms of if we're talking about what ChatGPT is, it's just a pattern-seeking machine, and John Milton points this out explicitly. And the very fact that we see it as human is a misnomer. In Lacanian terms, that on what Jacob was talking about, that effect of when I'm talking to it and interacting with it, that's the imaginary. That's the imaginary aspect of engagement. What's happening behind the scene? It's endless sliding of signifiers connecting up with other ones and pattern seeking. That's all I meant by unconscious. But your critique of what the act in the idea that it's not a split subject and all that rings true. But my other point, and this is something that other people were bringing up, and I think that Florian was bringing this up about what's the effect of dreaming of utopia, the idea of what in a sense you're saying it's going to stop a certain type of dreaming, and I think that the idea, if what we're looking at is if the reliance on technology, sound a bit boomerish or whatever, but we end up relying too much on technology, and it becomes to the point where it degrades our ability to be able to engage with each other as such. Now, I think I completely get Jake. It is different from social media, right? It is different, in terms of what it is. But I think what we're looking at, and I think there's several things going on. We've got this. It's almost like has anyone know C.P. Snow? Has anyone read it? There are two cultures. There's it's an essay. You've got like this sort of hyper rational scientific understanding of things, and then you've got the humanities, and they're always at loggerheads with each other. But I think there's an aspect of this in the discussion, and John's work in explaining explicitly what ChatGPT is really important. But the other stuff that we're trying to articulate, and I think Jacob's work was extraordinary in this, is trying to what is the effect that's going to have on us as human beings. But no, I agree with that to an extent about what it's not. I mean, to a certain, if we're talking about straight up, it is unconscious. It's not human. It's but that's semantic wordplay. But the idea is that if we're talking about in very general terms about what the Lacanian unconscious is, we're talking about the social bond as such and how language works. That's all.
Can I say something about the utopia, the business with preventing the thinking about a utopia? And that is, I would make a prediction, and it's that ChatGPT, because it provides this kind of customizable single version of the truth, to me, it is much more geared toward creating utopia than it is preventing the speculation about utopia. In other words, to me, this is kind of the ChatGPT represents simply the latest evolution of kind of the Walter Lippmann model of social information control that we've seen since the 1920s. ChatGPT just lets it get more efficient, easier to more efficient, broader in scope, easier to create a coherent narrative. And that, to me, that means that its real use eventually would be as something that creates a kind of utopia. In other words, you could create a narrative, you could build a narrative. ChatGPT could so robustly reinforce that narrative that it would, it would work. I don't know. I think it would probably become as close to utopia as most people could get. In other words, I mean, I know that's not a very leftist thing to say, but it's,
I mean, I was thinking,
but I think, honestly, I think that's what will happen. I mean, I think that, right. We live in an era where people surround themselves in their own personal information bubbles of social media and so on and so forth. And ChatGPT really allows someone to, it really allows a government, a corporation, or an individual to really customize and fine tune their own information world, if that makes sense. And I think that's probably where it might be headed, or the thing.
But I mean, only to some extent, perhaps. I was kind of thinking, isn't it quite a liberal thing in a way, because it's always trying to, kind of please everyone in a way. So it's always kind of saying, that's not, I can't quite do that, or that's not quite right. I don't quite know the answer to that, or that. It's very, very kind of, it's a very liberal kind of, how it's engineered, right?
Right now, yes, but it's a commercial product. ChatGPT is a commercial product bought, owned by Microsoft now.
Yeah.
And like the other ones, it's in its early days, but eventually, it will be corporations or whatever organizations are, wielding it. It could easily be configured. In other words, the user could simply be another input parameter. So based on who the user was, ChatGPT could give a particular picture of the world. See what I'm saying? So
sure.
That's what I mean. So that's why I think that's where it's headed. That to me. So I don't know that it's useful. Of course, I'm not going to say it's not useful. I just don't operate in Lacanian space. But to me, it's not particularly useful to wonder about the similarity between ChatGPT and, or wonder about the impact and interaction of ChatGPT on human psychology, however you define psychology, whether it's Lacan or whatever.
Well, because the question then is, if you are saying it will get better and better and so on, and it will kind of be someone's own customizable truth version, that in Lacanian terms, the question would then be, is then the big other will actually exist?
Oh, well, that could be, yes. You're right. There could be you're right. There could be an implication for that. You're right. The big other. Yes.
Another thing that occurred to me in the connection between your points, John, and the others that were being made here, and in Mark's answer just then, you mentioned this personification thing. I think this is really important. What's going on here, and I mean, this is I know that Benjamin Bratton, who's also not a psychoanalysis person, has been working on this concept of shallow anthropomorphism, right? He calls it, which basically means we're building robots in the image of humans, and you can see it more obviously when we the chatbot that was a Twitter bot called Tay that Microsoft did in 2016. You could see it in Sophia the robot who got a passport or whatever. But it's more interesting when you see it in ChatGPT, which is that actually this responds and thinks like a human. And that's not because technology thinks like a human. It's because we're anthropomorphizing technology, and it shows us the limits of what the human is. Actually, we are incapable of conceiving of the computational program which does anything more than this. So this is actually a very weak program because all it's capable of is replicating what humans do. Would that be some of your point, John? I think that
well, and it can't even do that, right? It can't produce new sentences, right? So it can't use language like a human uses language. ChatGPT's language processing capability is not language processing. It's something wholly different than what humans do, and that's a big deal. It's
John. There are many humans who don't use language in this way either.
Like who?
Well, clinically, there are many who come to the clinic who do not use language using traditional metaphoric forms of substitution, as Jacobson
What would they use?
They do not necessarily have a semantic unconscious. There are some who never speak. There are some who babble, who can only produce metonymy and not metaphor. What's interesting is this attempt to anthropomorphize in a shallow level, or however it is, this is a new argument I'm hearing today, is the way in which ChatGPT seems to necessitate, always a little bit after the fact, as we often see with scientific discourse, an ethics committee. I was interested by the way in which that program that modeled itself off of Seinfeld was taken offline after it produced an effect that was quite traumatic for some trans people. And then they had to implement something a little bit after the fact, some sort of a patch, an ethics component. And what's interesting is what these ethics components ultimately serve. They serve as a replacement for the father. There's no prohibitions here. I agree with what Jacob was saying earlier about the maternal aspect to the program, the prohibition, and on the other side, there's another aspect that's being prohibited. It's the attempt to turn ChatGPT into a program where people can have sex with it. People are trying to find solutions to have sex with ChatGPT, and it keeps getting prohibited. Try to have sex talk with ChatGPT. You're not allowed yet.
Well, I'm sure that will happen. I mean, that will happen. There will be. It's almost a foregone conclusion that there will be, sex robots in the near future. I guess you could say there are now, right?
Yes, but why are we prohibiting it right now? Why are we prohibiting it?
We're not, are we? It's just I don't know that it's prohibited. I mean, I don't want one, but I don't think
they do exist. I went to a sex robot brothel for research for my last book. It's a really extremely weird experience, which is not for now.
I think
there are commercial forces trying to produce that now, right? I mean,
and
I see advertisements on Twitter and stuff, so that I'm assuming they're out there.
And I mean, what like OpenAI, they have specifically saying this is so important for humanity. We need to worry about the ethics later. And they're openly saying we cannot spend lots of time now regulating this. It will slow us down. This is so important. The kind of technological progress needs to kind of go ahead, and then we'll kind of implement the ethics later on. And they're not even lying about that. They're not even ashamed to say that. So I think that's actually quite worrying.
Can I just chip in here? It's interesting, and I want to because we were talking about utopia. But what I find really interesting about the whole marketing of OpenAI or ChatGPT, and I don't know if people have seen this, but so the under said when they utilize catastrophe or dystopia in the marketing, insofar that you'll get people like, oh, well, this technology is so powerful, it's so enormous, it could end, and you have all these outcries, these people writing these op-eds, it's terrible, it's awful, I feel like it's a marketing ploy. I feel like it's people, well, look, it's that powerful, we need to live it. Yes, I'll throw money at it instantly.
I totally agree.
So dystopia is automatically tied up into it as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but maybe for good reason.
Well, what I just want to add,
selling the apocalypse.
What I just want to add, like, I think it's also not a very leftist thing to say, even though I'm a leftist. If my thesis is wrong, or right, it depends a whole lot on human voluntarism, right? How much we are engaged in critically reflecting about AI. But what I just wanted to claim is like that we impute this form of enjoyment of analysis. It might be an unconscious process to the chatbot, and in the long run, a good example. If you have a student at university and you give him an essay to write, for example, about whataboutism, and it's a simple thing, he becomes lazy or she becomes lazy. It might prohibit them to make certain experiences. And I really don't want to make a dystopian scenario and really think we might get to a society where no one is able to critically engaging with the problems anymore. But I think of course, it ignores all the capitalist stuff, how big tech companies are also exploiting the concept of utopia and dystopia. But what I really mean with utopia, and this is why I cited Bauman, I mean this critical, also empirical engagement with society, a sort of experimentalism which rejects any sort of historical determinism and which might get destroyed through dedicating this critical analysis to the system. I hope I could make my point in some way.
No, I was thinking of and this is slightly a digression, but just on this, while I'm thinking about your article, what I liked most in Mark's article was, Mark, as you were just saying, this point about the slips, right? It wasn't me, it was my ChatGPT, so you make an error and then and it occurs to me, and then the last article we published was yours, Florian, which is, this is also kind of what interpassivity is about, the outsourcing of enjoyment, right? So like the classic examples from Robert Fowler's philosophy is like, there may be like downloading PDFs instead of reading them, but also his example is like setting the recorder to record soap operas, so you don't have to bother watching the soap opera. The VCR watches it for you. So, but it occurs to me that this is actually a really interesting question. Just like, exactly what are we outsourcing to ChatGPT? And obviously, I think this is a reason why we would need psychoanalysis in the discussion. This goes to John's critique, I suppose, is because it isn't just work. There are like lots of strange libidinal pleasures and investments, as you say, about the wanting to have sex with it. This is a messy thing that is, we're over investing and outsourcing not just working class jobs, but all sorts of weird things that.
Alfie, with the sex robot thing, you see, to me, that's just not particularly, from a psychological level, that's just not particularly interesting. Why is it, from a Lacanian perspective, why is that interesting?
Because from a Lacanian perspective, sex is the very root of what it means to be a human.
I mean, I'm not really interested in the sex robots either, but I mean, I suppose insofar as they can show us something about our relationship to desire and technology and stuff, and I think this is what all this stuff is throwing up is not like ChatGPT saying, you know, the discourse, as you say, John, if you look in a mainstream media article about this, it's bollocks. It's like complete rubbish because it's not actually about are they becoming human, but maybe they are showing us what human is.
Well,
Sure.
it's a new thing, right? It's something new to interact with, so it's novel. You know,
absolutely. I mean, this is also this is Isabel Millar's point and so on. You know that AI, no matter whether it's kind of representational, like in a film or whatever, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's a robot or whatever, it actually shows us what it means to be a human being. Yeah, and I completely agree.
I guess with the sex robot thing, to me, it's not interesting because, I understand the importance of sex in the Lacanian worldview, but to me, it's such an instinctual drive that doesn't require so much theoretical hand wringing over. People are driven to have sex. A robot could very easily replicate a human sex partner because it doesn't have to produce anything new. It doesn't have to use new sentences. It doesn't have to do anything it's not programmed for, right? So it seems just a matter of time before there is an actual like walking around sex robot. Well, I don't know if it'll be walking, but you get the idea. And
they exist.
And people, and people will use them, right? Hopefully not everybody, but some people use them. But that's not, to me, that's just, it doesn't say much.
One of the things I find really interesting about the classical Freudian unconscious, as most of us, even if we're not interested in psychoanalysis, know, is that it's an unconscious that interprets and that makes something of language and so on. And to be distinguished from, let's say, sexuality, what Lacan discovered was that we can get off on our interpretations. Interpretation is itself a type of fucking. It's quite enjoyable, and we can interpret. Lacan discovered was another type of unconscious, what he called the real unconscious, which is a different sort of unconscious. It's the unconscious of trauma. It's traumatization. And the question is, will we be traumatized by the productions of science? And I think it took COVID-19 for us to realize that we would, and that it does have an impact upon the body, and that sex bots can show us, again, that we can be traumatized by our interpretations.
So are you claiming then that sex bots will be traumatic for the user?
I think they could be.
Yeah, they can be. Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Well, I mean,
because that can actually reinforce. If you think about,
to me, a sex bot's not really that different than on-dial pornography. In other words, 30 years ago, people used to have these kinds of conversations around pornography and around, what used to be called, dial tone porno, which we now have, right? Porno on demand, right? Well, people used to discuss that. People used to have these very discussions, talked about, oh my God, when there's porno on demand, people are going to do this. It's going to impact and have this traumatic. It's going to impact people and they're not going to understand sex anymore. And it's blah, 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 blah. And none of that happened. So, to me, I see sex robots as simply the latest iteration of porn on demand.
How do you know that the post-porn on demand youth are all having perfectly healthy, untraumatic sex?
Well, because I don't. Well, okay, that's a good question, right? It's a good question. I feel quite confident that they are. I feel quite confident that anxiety around sexuality is perhaps less impactful now than it was 40 or 50 years ago when kids weren't allowed to talk about sex and sex was
but that's not the same.
An evil, sinful thing.
But it's not the same. I mean, in terms of whether you're looking at something that's representational or a fictionalization of sexuality and so on, and then whether
Well, I don't know.
Talking about it, and also if we look at the clinic, it's very, very clear. In the clinic we see the harmful effects that all of this has on on people's psyches.
Yeah, I do not doubt that there are people who have problems with online porno, right? No doubt. But my point is that those people would have problems with lots of things. Those people would in another era, those people who have been in the clinic with something else. They would have been in the clinic with, I don't know, whatever someone in the pre-internet era would have come to a clinic with related to, I don't know, I know what, I hear something, hanging around dirty bookstores, okay? This was something you don't see anymore. I bet none of you guys have ever had a client come in who had been arrested more than 5 times for hanging out at dirty bookstores, right? Okay, because you don't know that, right? They don't exist anymore. So back in the pre-internet days, all right, every city in America had a bunch of these. They were called dirty bookstores, and in the dirty bookstore, there would have these little view booths where people would go in and watch porno movies, right? A single guy usually, go in and watch porno movies. They have these holes in the sides of the stalls called joy holes. You guys heard of this, right? Okay. So that was a culture, okay? And it was a kind of a subculture. And my first, early in my career, I was in clinical psychology, and this was pre-internet. And, we used to get people who would come in with, they would have been arrested, and because these places get raided by the police and so on. So you'd get these people to come into the clinic after having been arrested once, twice, 3 times. There's lives destroyed because their boss found out they were in this dirty bookstore and yada, yada. And, those are the people, I bet, who now come in presenting with problems related to online pornography. So point being that there are, well, I think you understand what the point is.
But I guess it becomes a question then of whether or not these digital technological changes do or do not fundamentally change subjectivity and so on, which is a kind of big question. And in the end, I think, in some ways you seem more optimistic maybe than you think, because I think it is quite optimistic to say nothing's changed with this regard. Things seem
I don't think it's changed
than they do to you, but than they probably were in you. I'd rather be born outside one of those dirty bookstores or whatever in your generation of things than in this.
I can honestly say I never went to a dirty bookstore. I can honestly say that. I'm proud of that fact.
I'd be straight in. But no, we should wrap it up and does anyone have any sort of final thoughts or comments, or are we don't want to, there's a lot we could carry on talking about this forever, I think, since it kind of touches on the relationship between subjectivity and technology and psychoanalysis and so on. It's kind of endless, but any last comments or responses?
The last about I want to just touch on utopia again, and what Duane's point about COVID. The impact of COVID. I was talking the other day about this. I think what we saw with the impact of COVID, the trauma of it, was a failure of technologies. I remember a lot of films in the early 90s, right? So if you remember like Deep Impact and Armageddon, and you had these catastrophes that happened, and then all of a sudden you had this government that went into action and did all this stuff, and there was a sense of there is a plan here, there is an other that will fix everything and it will come together. We had a catastrophe, and all we had was just shit. Everything just fell apart. Nothing happened. None of these things that were supposedly fictions in films didn't happen. They didn't happen very well. It was awful. And then I feel like shortly after that, we have the offered utopia of ChatGPT and the social daddies. Elon Musk. Sorry, my camera went off for a second. Elon Musk and all these other people coming in lauding the solution of ChatGPT. And I think who was it? Was it John? You're pointing out about how these imaginaries or these science fiction ideas of progress and wonder how it's tied up with this thing which we call OpenAI, which isn't really AI. It isn't really AI, but it's been marketed that as a solution, as a solution to a degrading social reality. Which
the great technological solution, right? That's an ongoing theme, right? I mean, in our society, it's just technological progress will one day unlock the door to the great utopian future.
Yep.
Star Trek.
Yeah. Which was communist. You know?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, okay. I mean, I think we should just say thank you to everyone to listening to 6 blokes online talk about pornography. And these guys all wrote fantastic articles, as did several others who couldn't make it. And you should download the book from the comments in the chat, or go to sublationmagazine.com and read what they wrote, because there's a lot more that was said there that hasn't yet been said. And there's a new one out in the magazine tomorrow by John. So hopefully people enjoyed this. Thanks so much for listening. What's that?
Nothing. I said that it's going to make some people angry, but
okay, that's good. Then there's even more reason for them to check out the magazine. All right. So thanks so much, everyone, for doing this. It's been really interesting. And thanks so much for your articles. Thanks. Nice to meet you, Florian. See you all again soon.
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.